In this episode, I am once again joined by Leigh Brasington, Buddhist meditation teacher and author of Right Concentration, a practical guide to the Jhanas. In this episode, we had planned to discuss Leigh's latest book, entitled On the Way to the Far Shore. Instead, Leigh spontaneously began to explore the theme of Buddhism and politics, and so we decided to go deeper into his ideas. Leigh shares his take on the world situation and reveals the impact of his childhood and college education on the development of his own political views. Leigh discusses whether or not Buddhist spiritual development necessarily leads to left-wing politics, reflects on the role of compassion and interdependence in the left-right divide, and considers whether or not past Buddhist masters who held different political views to his own lacked enlightenment. Leigh also warns about the dangers of clinging to fixed views, gives advice about how meditators should relate to politics, and explains why he believes political engagement is a natural result of the spiritual path. So without further ado, Leigh Brasington.
The more complex a system is, the more likely it is to fail. And our 21st century technological, quote, civilization is extremely complex. Plus, there's the overarching inequality in economics worldwide. In the US, the top 1% now has, $6 trillion more than it had in the 80s. And the bottom 90% has $5 trillion less. So most of the wealth that has been accumulated for the 1% in the last 50 years has come from stealing from the poor and giving to the rich. So that's a very unstable situation. It just is not it's not gonna work. Too many people are feeling that they're being taken advantage of. This is why Trump managed to get elected. And they are being taken advantage of, only they don't have a good idea for how to deal with it, unfortunately. So, yeah. It's a very complex system, and complex systems don't respond well to changes. Plus, on top of all of this, we have things like global warming. I mean, that's the biggest threat facing everyone on this planet. If we clean up everything else, but still continue to put carbon dioxide in the air at the same rate, the system is going to collapse. It just can't go on like this. And so I think when things get stressful in one area, the stress bleeds over into another area. When I was, 17, I just turned 18. I went to Mexico with a group of kids from the North Mississippi Presbytery. So my father was a Presbyterian minister, and the state of Mississippi was divided into 3 presbyteries, 3 local groups, a third of the state. So about 1 million people in each group. The Presbyterians made up a very small number of that million. And so the North Mississippi Presbytery set up this thing so that you could apply as someone who was going to be a senior in high school the next year to go as part of a group to visit the mission fields in Mexico, which was actually pretty good. The first time I'd ever been in the third world or anything like that. And it was great. There were 16 kids and 4 chaperones, and so we had a blast. And we went to Mexico City and Morelia and Acapulco. I mean, it was really, really good. And the last night, we're sitting there talking to some of the missionaries, and one of them says, after the turn of the century, the United States will be putting up a wall to keep out people from Mexico from coming in. The population explosion here is going to be so great that the pressure, to come to the United States will be such that the U.S. will put up a wall. This was 1966 when he said that, and he was exactly right. And so, yeah, we've got too many people on this planet. We're using up the resources at an unsustainable rate. We're basically using the resources for each year, we're using them up by July. And that's unsustainable. So it's going to collapse because of that, if it doesn't collapse because of global warming before that. So, yeah, the situation is pretty bad everywhere. And the people in charge have no idea what to do to fix it, or those who do don't have enough power to do anything about it. Mostly the people in charge are, just padding their pockets along the way, especially in this country.
Have we begun the podcast, do you think? Should we include some of this?
If you're recording it, this is up to you. Yeah,
Okay.
I was just thinking, this is an interesting conversation in and of itself.
Right. Yeah, well, let's go with it. What was coming to my mind as you were talking was, how do you relate to that as a practitioner? I don't necessarily mean as a teacher, but as a practitioner. Does it bother you? Do you really care that much about it? We were saying before, you have a quite nice life, and these things, I'm not sure that any of them really touch you directly. A lot of the things you're talking about, you're concerned about other people, other places, the future, other times. How do you relate to that as a practitioner, this issue of politics?
Yeah. So the number one thing is, what can I do? Right? I can't solve global warming by myself. I can't solve the creeping fascism. Well, it's not even creeping anymore. The fascism rising in the United States. So what can I do? Well, I can try and educate people. I can try, putting things out there that may help people understand what's going on. And I do attempt to do that. I don't know how successful it is. It certainly doesn't have a huge reach. The books I write aren't ones that are going to directly address any of that. The one on dependent origination gives some idea for people to gain a better understanding of the interrelated nature of everything that's going on. But yeah, how can I help? All right, I can't really solve all of the problems. I don't have solutions. I mean, yeah, I have solutions, but I can't implement them. You know, uh, that the solutions I have are the solutions that society as a whole has to take up, not just me individually. Yes, I drive an electric car. Yes, I have solar on the roof of the house. That sort of thing. But that's a very tiny drop in a great big bucket. So about all I can do is education and try and keep my personal carbon footprint as small as possible. As for my practice, generally, I don't let it bother me. In other words, I could get all worked up about the injustice in the world or in any number of other things, the dangers of global warming, the inequality, the resource. When I give a talk on the hindrances, I point out, on the precepts, I point out the first hindrance, not to kill. Yeah, if we're using up the resources of the world at an unsustainable rate, that's going to kill a lot. And for the second precept, not to take what's not given, I point out that I don't think future generations have given us permission to use up all the resources. So, it's possible to take, when I'm teaching, some of the Buddhist teachings and apply them directly to the problems. But me saying that in a Dharma talk at the start of a retreat, does that really impact people's behavior? Do they reduce their carbon footprint, use less resources just because I've talked about it? I talk about renunciation. And okay, renunciation for a layperson means using up less of the resources. You don't have to go to 3 ropes and a bowl. It's not possible as a layperson, but trying to educate people to do that. But it's a small amount of stuff I can do with the teaching I do. And so when I sit down to meditate, occasionally something that I've read in the news or something comes up and it's there and it's annoying me and it's my distraction for that sitting. Mostly, yeah, I can just set this aside because, as you say, I'm not personally impacted by it. And that makes it so much easier to set it aside. If I was worried that the Gestapo was coming for me, yeah, it might be really hard to set it aside. It would be really hard. So I wouldn't say that it messes with my practice that much. I have other far more trivial things that tend to be what my distractions are. And if I can get them under control, then I've got the jhanas to get a really nice, deep concentration going. And then my insight practice goes well. Then the timer goes off.
Undoubtedly, some of the things, just the nature of politics that you've said today, your opinions on politics and world issues, some people will have disagreed with that in maybe in small details, or maybe in quite fundamental ways. And so, but of course, what you're saying now isn't really relevant to your particular view. You're talking now about whatever political opinion you have to have. How do you relate to it? If I might ask a provocative question, something, or at least in a provocative way, why do you care? And I'll say something more about it. I think of, for example, Plato, this sort of philosophical tradition. There is a reasoning for political engagement there. There's a kind of a case made, if you like, for political engagement. Now, it's a particular kind of case, right, that he makes. But the fact is that there's sort of rationale as to why one ought to be involved in the polis and all that. In terms of Buddhism, is there a similar encouragement to be involved? When I think of Buddhism, at least just off the top of my head, I think especially Hinayana Buddhism or early Buddhism, I think of renunciation. I think of a period of social flux in which people renounced political and engagement in the forest and so on. So what is your, if you want, reason for or case for political engagement at all, especially given, as you've pointed out, this sense of impotence, that there's not much you can do anyway? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah. It's a very good question. I think it applies to everybody who's practicing seriously. For me, I can put it in one word: compassion. In other words, I feel with others. It's interesting. In the Mahayana, it's a big deal about how the Buddha became awakened, and his motivation was out of compassion for the world. And the whole Jhanas thing is about learning to be more compassionate. But you read the suttas, and the Buddha, he was seeking some peace. Look at Sutta Nipata 4:15. He says he left home because everybody was quarreling. He was looking for some peace. You read others, he's looking for the end of old age, sickness, and death. It was a personal quest. And it was only after his awakening that the motivation became for the benefit of others. And so that's quite interesting. I mean, maybe it's not recorded in the suttas. He had some ideas that, yeah, if I can figure this out, it'll be for the benefit of others or something like that. But it didn't make it into the stories that we have. Now, I tell people, don't take any of the stories as history. Okay, follow the directions of what to do to practice rather than worry about the history of it. But it's interesting. It's like that. And I find as I got more and more deeply involved in the practice, the more insight I got, the more I felt the connection with other living beings around me. And I mean, I was never a cruel person, but the compassion just naturally was welling up. And then as I began to look at it, I remember going on one retreat And I had just done a 24-day retreat with Ayakema. And this was 2 weeks later, it was a 10-day retreat with Sokne Rinpoche. Uh, and I remember sitting down, or at some point early on, they talk about interconnectedness. I want to know more about this interconnectedness thing. I want to see that. So I'm in pretty good space because I've just spent 24 days concentrated, working pretty well. Uh, and I go to eat my lunch on the second full day of the retreat. And as I stuff a piece of salad, a bite of salad into my face, I realized that the lettuce I was eating was picked by some poor fellow working in the hot fields in the sun. It's July in California. This was picked recently. It was hot out there in the Central Valley. And he was poor. And he probably was a migrant from Mexico. This was who was doing most of the farm work in California. And my life was tied up with his. I couldn't see him with my eye, but I could certainly see him with my mind's eye. And his sweat was giving me this bite of food. It was so touching, I dropped my fork and started crying. And I began to understand the interconnectedness of everything. And that's what blossomed during that retreat, was more and more just insight into the interconnectedness of me to a much wider field of life. And that has continued since then, getting a sense of it. In the book on dependent origination, I talk about sutta, streams of dependently arising processes interacting. And that's eventually where I came to with that interconnectedness. There's just all these streams of dependently arising processes that are intersecting at this point I call me. But I am not separate from them, nor am I the same as them. That's from Nagarjuna. You're not the same as or different from the conditions on which you depend. You're neither forever fused with them nor ever separated from them. This is the deathless teaching of Buddhas who care for the world. That's chapter 18 on the self from the Mohoyamaka Karika. That was the statement that led me more to Sotapai than everything else. So seeing all this coming at me and realizing I'm not the same as all the other living creatures out there, but I'm forever fused with them. And then getting the picture of, all of this is vastly interconnected. It's not that it's that everything arises dependent on other things, but not everything is connected to everything else, but everything is connected to enough other things that it becomes a net, a single unfolding universe. And I'm just a piece of that universe. So I began to get this vision of the universe as a net. And I'm just one node in that net, but I am connected to a number of other nodes, especially as a teacher. At that point on that retreat, I wasn't teaching yet, but I started 3 years later teaching. And so the connections that I have, can I somehow put into words that people can relate to, so that they can see this vast interconnectedness. If you see this vast interconnectedness, then the compassion is automatic. I first got this also from Stephen Batchelor, reading his book, The Way of the Bodhisattva, his translation of Shantideva's Way of the Bodhisattva. And in the dedication of merit, which I personally think is the best part of the book, I mean, the wisdom chapter is really important and brilliant, but the dedication of merit is even more important, I think. Shantideva talks about, if this hand gets caught, this other hand doesn't go, oh, you stupid hand. It's immediately helping out because it recognizes the interconnectedness. we need to recognize that interconnectedness with all beings. So what can I do? I can point out the interconnectedness when I'm teaching a retreat. I put this in my book on dependent origination, trying to get people to see in that direction. There's two quotes at the end of my book on dependent origination that I'd like to share if this is actually going to wind up on the podcast. A human being is part of a whole called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. The striving to free oneself from this delusion is the one issue of true religion. Not to nourish the delusion, but to try and overcome it is the way to reach the unattainable measure of peace of mind. That's Albert Einstein. He was kind of a smart guy. The other one, all I'm saying is simply this, that all mankind is tied together. All life is interrelated, and we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. That's from another very smart guy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, yeah, this is where the Buddha's teaching on dependent origination has led me. And there's no other reaction to that but compassion. And so the reason that I care is because it's happening to me, because I'm not separate from everybody else. Just like if this hand is caught, this hand automatically is there to help.
That's very interesting. Thank you. When I think back through Buddhist history, what little I know of it, I think of all the different forms of governance that have been, that Buddhism has sort of, coexisted with, and the different forms of governance that Buddhists have endorsed or wielded, actually. For example, the various forms of kingship, various forms of priest politic union rule, as they have in Tibet, for example. And then I think of, I spend a lot of time listening to people on this podcast, and I hear a lot of different opinions. And sometimes I hear people express their compassion when they, politically, with quite diverse views. It seems to me that some people feel that the expression of compassion is, say, in this particular political opinion, but then another person will express their compassion with another rationalization, another way in which they arrive at that, and it's the opposite one. I don't mean to say that every view is equally compassionate, but I do mean to say that most views, it seems, can be arrived at by some sort of rationale derived from compassion. So maybe that's a bit of a long-winded way of saying, how do you relate to your own particular political views? Have you had a change in political view in any of your primary positions or orientation as this compassion has grown? Has it caused you to reevaluate, for example, certain political positions? Or has it given a sort of energy to pre-existing political views? And do you see in those who oppose your political views, those who have different views to you, I mean, maybe even the opposite to certain conclusions you have, do you see them as misguided, lacking compassion? How do you relate to them? Or do you recognize compassion in what they're asserting, but a different understanding of causality, perhaps, or what needs to happen in order for things to get better, etc., etc.? So where do you stand on that? I'm curious.
Yeah. So my political views have indeed changed, but not recently. Okay. I grew up in Mississippi. I remember white-only bathrooms and white-only water fountains. And black people didn't vote because they weren't allowed to. So my political views, because I was a dumb kid, were just the views of everybody around me. And then I went off to university, to a liberal arts college. And liberal was the word at that time. This is the 60s. Okay. And it was very liberal. And my views I'm bringing from the Mississippi Delta were not the same as the majority of people who were there. Uh, but I began fairly quickly to see they had a point, that what they were saying, although it was different from me, made more sense than what I had that I never actually thought about. I just inherited. So yeah, my political views changed from entering my first year at university to the end of my first year at university. But it still wasn't political. I just, was a little more compassionate in my views. And they changed more as time went on, becoming more liberal, until by the time I had graduated, I was, yeah, definitely a liberal. I was a hippie, a liberal hippie. And to make no apologies, I'm actually proud of that. So, yeah, and I've kept that ever since. It hasn't changed since, yeah, the early 70s. That's when it reached this. It's a little more sophisticated, perhaps. And the reason behind my views have changed, as I expressed, because of a deeper understanding of the interconnected nature of everything. So I feel I have a heavier, more solid grounding for my views. But to your question of how do I think about, address people with different views? So the last chapter that I was reading those two quotes from my Dependent Origination book is entitled Don't Be Fooled by Your Conceptualizing. And one of the more important points I try and make in that book is how sanya, which is usually translated as perception, is so important. I want to translate it as conceptualization rather than perception. And I want to actually translate it as conceptualizing because I want to make it a verb. And we take in the world and we have to chop it up into bits and pieces because we can't take in the universe because our little pea brains are way too small. So we chop it up into bits and pieces, and I can eat this, and this is something I can wear, and this house I can live in. And that person is scary, and we're making all of these conceptualizations. And the bad thing is we believe our concepts are correct. One of the most important teachings in, I think, all of the suttas is the Buddha's teaching on not clinging to fixed views. This is very important in Sutta Nipata Book 4. It's one of the two overriding themes in there is not holding to fixed views. We also find that exact phrase at the end of the Metta Sutta, which is also from the Sutta Nipata. And you think about it, keeping an open mind is what's essential on any endeavor where you're trying to change for the better. If you don't leave where you are, you're not going to get anywhere else. So keeping an open mind is extremely important, and all views should be held lightly. So I look at other people who have different views, and I try and understand why do they have that view and why are they clinging to it so tightly. In some instances, it's the view they inherited. This is where they grew up. This is the view everybody around them has. We're social creatures. If you have a different view and express it, you get ostracized. That doesn't work. And everybody you know has this view, and they all seem like they know what they're doing, so you adopt that view. And once we adopt any view, it's hard to let go of it because we begin structuring our world around that view, depending on how big the view is. If the view is chocolate's good for you, then you eat too much chocolate. If your view is those people don't deserve to be in this country, then you start doing really weird stuff. So there's the inheriting of views and the clinging to views, because once it's my view, of course, I don't want to let it go. There's also fear. I mentioned inequality earlier. There's a huge amount of inequality, and those who have had a lot taken from them don't want any more taken from them. And they see other people, and if they have any, shall we say, unearned privilege, they don't want to give up their unearned privilege to those people who haven't earned the privilege. And so they other those people who might shift things so they don't have the privilege anymore. So now this fear. And fear is a huge motivator. It may be the biggest motivator of all for anything anybody does. It's greed, hatred, and delusion. Greed, fear, and stupidity. Not knowing what's really happening, that are the underlying causes of a lot of stuff. So someone else who has a view that I judge as not compassionate, I'm trying to see, where did this view come from? And sometimes it's really obvious they came from, say, a part of the United States where that view is prevalent. And I'm also trying to see why it's so difficult for them to let go of that view, which actually is not serving them. And usually what I see is fear. Sometimes it's greed. I mean, those in power, it's often greed. But those huge supporter of those in power, it's fear. It's fear of losing something that maybe they deeply feel isn't theirs, but they don't want to let it go. Maybe they just fear losing it. They don't have any rationale other than I don't want to lose it. So a lot of the lack of compassion I see is due to fear. And I look back on myself when I was younger, and yeah, sometimes the way I acted, which wasn't perhaps the most compassionate way at that time, was fear. Fear of being ostracized by the group, fear if I acted that way, it might not be a good thing for me. I wasn't seeing the interconnectedness, and that was the problem.
Do you think that if someone becomes more, progresses along the path, let's put it that way, and learns to let go of fixed, grasping to things like views and so on, do you think that their politics will tend to trend closer to yours, and that yes, that's my question.
They answer, well, of course, I have the right view. So, of course, they're going to see the light and come my way. Yeah. I think once somebody really gets the interconnected nature, then it's going to become more progressive. It's going to become more of a we instead of us and them. I think this is inevitable if they get it deeply enough. But I've known people who were quite advanced, at least in some portions of the path, who still have conservative views. It always shocks me when I find this out. How come you don't see? So, is my view the correct view? Well, every view has its limitation because, as I mentioned, the universe is too big for us to take it all in. So any view is going to have limitations, but we can't operate without views. We can't take everything as absolutely new and try and figure it out on the fly every single time. We're going to have views in there. And we remember to hold them lightly until something better comes along. I think one of the best things for teaching me that was the 3-year trip I took around the world when I was 29, 30, 31. Okay. When I came back, my friends could see I was different. I was a changed person because I had been in so many situations where I didn't have the answer. I had to figure it out on the fly, how to navigate the Indian Railway buying a train ticket, things like that. I mean, nothing prepares you for that other than talking to other travelers and getting the idea and going and attempting to do so. Um, but there were lots of other instances where, yeah, the views I had just were not appropriate to the situation. And I began to see that. And so I think that was really helpful to get out of my comfortable culture and go expose myself to what it's like to be a human being in all of its varieties, I think was the best thing from that whole trip. I mean, I had a lot of fun too, but even better was what I learned. And the lesson was how to be human.
Earlier, I mentioned that when I think of the history of Buddhism, and I think of the various different political systems under which Buddhism has existed, and the masters and practitioners that were involved in those systems, sometimes politically involved in those systems. The ones that I can think of, I think would have political views quite different to yours. Many of the starting assumptions would be so far away from even the debates that you'd have with someone of your opposite number in the States today. Do you think that if they had been more aware of interconnectedness and interdependence, in other words, do you think the distance between their view and yours is a distance in their deficiency in their understanding of interdependence compared to your understanding of interdependence? So now you talked a bit about how people today, you think really that people today who hold conservative views as Buddhists, you think that surprises you because you feel like the more you understand interdependence and the compassion that comes from that you're going to trend towards your positions because you feel that's what's informing your positions, or at least that's what's energizing your positions. What informed your position was your college education, of course. But anyway, if we go back in time and we think of people who had very different political views to yours in very different contexts, is there a deficiency there in them that is the cause of that difference?
I don't know whether the deficiency is in them or the society which they're a part of. In other words, if that person were picked up and put in a society that was more compassionate, more recognizing the interconnected nature, would they eventually let go of their selfish view and pick up a more compassionate one? We are the product of, Otopi, streams of definitely arising processes interacting, and a huge number of those streams of the culture in which we were raised. One of the more interesting courses I took at that college, Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, was social psychology. And the professor, just the first day, started drawing like a target on the board. There was the bullseye, and then around that were more and more and more concentric circles. And he said, who we are from a sociological standpoint depends on where we are in this, what the family of origin, who our friends were, and going out, the culture that we're in at the outermost level, a human being, a mammal, a resident of Earth, and all of this feeds in. And so I've known some very smart people who had very divergent political views from me, but I also knew something about their background. Was it possible that if they were put in a situation where they couldn't keep reinforcing their selfish, I'm using that word pejoratively, but anyhow, their selfish views, if they were in a situation where they weren't getting reinforcement for the selfish views, would they change? I'm thinking of one of my fraternity brothers in Phi Beta Kappa. You got to be pretty smart to get in there. And this guy, he was still fighting the Civil War, He he had other views. Now, he didn't live on campus. He lived in town, so he wasn't getting the reinforcement that those of us who lived on campus got. But he probably couldn't afford to live on campus. It was cheaper to live at home. And okay, so again, the whole wad of influences coming in. Had he lived on campus, would he have changed his views? I don't know. He may have found the other conservative people on campus and just hung out with them. Um, it's really, there is an individual in the sense that there are individual bodies that are separate from other bodies. But there is no individual on psychological level. We are always so influenced by so much that's going on in the people that we associate with, the movies we watch, the books we read, the society we live in. So nobody is separate there. Are they able to learn from what they're experiencing and see this interconnectedness? Or are they stuck in their own selfish interest, which often happens? And why are they stuck in that selfish interest? Is it greed? Is it fear? Is it just simply delusion? Don't know, but it's probably one of those three.
Interesting. So I'm hearing two things. On the one hand, I'm hearing you say that there is a relationship between one's political views and insight into interdependence, and that one will trend towards your political position, generally speaking, with a greater, deeper insight into interdependence. Fair enough.
I think so.
Okay, yeah, that's your position, and that. But I'm also hearing you say that political views are conditioned by one's background, the time in which one lives, etc. And that makes me think, is it possible to be an awakened person, deeply awakened person, and believe that the earth is flat? I think at a certain time, at a certain place, yes, if that's the understanding of science at the time, in the past, let's say, in some distant past time, I could imagine myself a very enlightened person believing the earth is flat. In that sense, if we think about views being conditioned, I can understand an enlightened theocrat. I could understand an enlightened oligarch. I might even understand an enlightened tyrant. If it was only that the political views were conditioned by the time and place and background, that would be an easy way of saying it. Well, those great masters of the past, they were great masters, but they endorsed theocracy or perhaps even wielded power as a theocrat, whatever the case is, because political views are a bit like scientific knowledge. You don't know what you don't know, and you can't really blame them for that. They're still deeply realized. But now you're also saying this other thing, which is that with realization and insight comes a trending towards your particular political position. So that cuts off our easy way of tying up the past and saying, well, they just didn't know any better. Those old enlightened masters didn't know any better. So I would ask you then, can you imagine an enlightened conservative? Can you imagine an enlightened theocrat? Can you imagine an enlightened oligarch or an enlightened tyrant? Can you imagine that as a thought experiment?
Not really. Okay. All right. So there are a number of mythological suttas that basically some person in power, the king, eventually has an awakening experience, and they become much more compassionate, and they treat their subjects better and so forth. So the idea that if you really get it, what the Buddha was teaching, if you really get it even before the Buddha existed, of how the world is actually working, then you will become beneficial as opposed to selfish. The problem we have is, what does it mean to be enlightened? Okay. And I would say you operate in a way that doesn't lead to the harm for yourself or for others. The harm for yourself would be an experience of dukkha, and you get out of that by not doing craving and clinging. And the harm for others would be that you operate in a way that doesn't cause them dukkha. And there are a number of suttas where the Buddha talks about this. Now, there certainly have been spiritual masters who were supporting regimes that really weren't all that compassionate. And maybe they did know a lot about the spiritual path, but I think they're missing this one particular ingredient. This is just my opinion, and it's arising because of my views, and all views should be held very lightly. So I don't think they were fully awakened. There's the thing about certain spiritual teachers being very advanced and then getting into trouble because of their sexual behavior with their students. How advanced were they? You look at the 4 stages of awakening, which is another view, but it's kind of interesting. All right, stream entry. You really get a sense of what the Buddha is talking about. That's pretty clear. It could say that you have an experience of not self, right? But it still leaves you feeling like this is self. And as I came and said, it hasn't really touched greed and hatred. At the second level, you've taken it to a level where, maybe you wouldn't operate in a way where you harm others for your own benefit. I'll read you the verses from the end of the Mukkalinda Sutta. This is Udana 2.1. The verses have nothing to do with the prose. Let's see. We want Ireland's version, I think. Blessed is detachment for one who is content, for one who has learned Dhamma and who sees. Stream entry. Blissful is non-afflection in the world, restraint towards living creatures. I take this to mean that if this dog poop on your lawn, you wouldn't throw it next door into the neighbor's lawn. That would be affliction on the others. And you wouldn't cheat on your spouse. And if you're a spiritual teacher, you wouldn't misuse that power for sexual predation. Okay, that's at the second level of awakening. All right. At the third level, blissful is passionless in the world, the overcoming of sensual desires. Okay, so at the second level of awakening, you've reduced greed and hatred. At the third, you've overcome greed and hatred. That's the passionlessness in the world. Your mind is no longer colored. Remember, the word that we translate as passion is raga, which means to color. And so dispassion, viraga, your mind is no longer colored by your desires. You've overcome it. And then the last verse, but the abolition of the conceit I am, that is truly supreme bliss. This is full awakening. And I think if one has abolished the I am feeling, you've got to be left with the interconnectedness of all life. But that's just my opinion. But I can back it up with quotes from the Buddha.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear you talk like this, and I'm grateful that you're willing to reflect on it and entertain these questions, because in a way, what we're talking about is independent of your particular political view. Of course, whatever view you have is important in one sense, but in another sense, the conversation we're having is not really about what your view is. It's in a way, it's about how you relate to your political view. So I think in that sense, it's very useful and apolitical in an odd kind of a way. When we look back at the history of Buddhism in various countries, Japan, Tibet, and so on, there's no doubt, I think, that the majority of Buddhist masters have been rather more conservative than even many conservatives that would be your opposite number in the States. There's no doubt about that. And so what I'm hearing you say is that that cannot simply be explained by the fact that they grew up in a certain time in a certain place, but in fact also is a consequence of a deficiency in their insight into interdependence, with their inability to see beyond their conditioning due to an insufficiency in their insight. That's quite interesting. Does it give you pause at all to suggests that your 21st century left of center American political position is, in a sense, the current sort of bleeding edge of enlightened politics against not only those who hold different views around the world today, but also of all the masters and practitioners and so on in the past who hold radically different views. Does it give you pause at all to think that somehow it all trends towards your position? I'm not saying it should give you pause at all, and I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with your position. That's irrelevant. I'm just thinking as a structure of way of relating to one's views. Does that give you a pause at all? Do you think to yourself, wow, how lucky that it just so happens that it's the case that you're holding the view that's the most consonant with interdependence?
The fact that my view is what it is, I try and keep in mind it's just another concept, right? It seems to fit my understanding. It seems to be helpful, things like that. What I'm concerned about is, does my view rest on, I don't want to say solid ground, but does it rest on a deep understanding of how the world actually functions? Okay? Does it rest in particular on being in harmony with the interconnected nature of all life? That's what concerns me. Am I doing a good enough job to stay true to that? The fact that my view turns out to be one that's supported by the culture I live in. I mean, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, the most liberal place in the United States. And yeah, there's lots of support for having that view. I have friends in places like Memphis, where I went to college, that they still live there and they have the same views as I do. So it's not like it's totally coming out of being here, but it's certainly supported by being here. But as I've gotten deeper and deeper on the spiritual path and become more obviously aware of the interconnected nature of the world, I find that compassion is the best motivation for my actions. I mean, we look at the Eightfold Path. Number 2, right intention. What is right intention? Renunciation, non-ill will, and harmlessness, to translate literally, or letting go, love, and compassion. And I thought about it. What if everybody on the planet was operating from those principles? Oh, I want to live on that planet. You know, nobody's out to get more. Everybody's trying to let go as much as possible. Leave what's out there if I don't need it. No ostentatious consuming. And acting out of love and compassion every time you interact with another living being. Yeah, that's where I want to live. Well, the only way I'm ever going to live on a place like that is to act like that myself. If I don't act like that myself, it'll never happen. Of course, it may never happen anyhow, but I can at least do my part and try and act in that way. And so that's what colors my view more than anything else. And that the ability to articulate that and the ability to use that as a guiding star arose because I was teaching it. You know, I'd never given it that much thought. And then I got to give a Dharma talk tonight. Oh, yeah, I'll do the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. That's a good thing to talk about. And I do that talk over and over again. And as I give the talk, each time I see a little more, because I'm trying to explain it to the students, and people ask me questions occasionally about it. And so my view became more oriented towards letting go, love, and compassion. And like I said, reading The Way of the Bodhisattva had a big impact on me, the dedication of merit. So, yeah, this is what colors my view. And if other highly respected people from the past weren't acting in harmony with that, I'm not going to say that they were fully awakened. They might have had a lot of spiritual understanding and experience, but there was more work to do. And, they're part of the culture they're in. Acting in that more compassionate way maybe just wasn't possible for them, given the situation and the necessity of keeping their position. If they let go of their position, it would go to somebody worse or something like that. So all these compromises get made. I don't have a position. I'm just a hippie computer programmer who wound up teaching meditation. So I'm not supported by any group. I don't have to report to any Dharma center or anything. I just have to do a good job. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I have enough friends around me to keep tabs on what I'm doing so that if I start doing stupid stuff, they'll call me on it. When I was in Jack Kornfield's teacher training program, we met 4 times a year for 4 years, for 4 days each time. And one of those days always was dedicated to spending the day with another teacher. And the best one of those was the day we spent with Yvonne Rand, who is a Zen teacher who lived in the Bay Area at the time. She's passed away. She was a force. She was like Ayya and Ruth Denison, a real force of Dharma nature. And she gave 2 pieces of advice that really stuck. 1, don't believe your publicity. And 2, you must have people around you that will call you on your stuff. And I'm very lucky in that I do have a number of people that call me. So I'm hoping that what I've come to is an accurate representation of what the Buddha was trying to teach. But I'm also privileged in the fact that I don't have to report to anybody except my understanding of what the Buddha was teaching.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's grant your position, take it as a starting point, that an insight into interdependence, as it deepens, will trend towards your political position in its specifics.
It will trend towards a compassionate political position, maybe not exactly mine.
Right, but in a way that's obfuscating a bit because you believe your position is the most compassionate one.
Well, it's the most compassionate one I've been able to manifest. I'm still working on it.
Okay. So are you saying now that it's not the case that a deeper insight into interdependence will trend towards your political position?
I'm saying it will trend towards a compassionate political position.
Okay.
And my current political position is my understanding of how to have a compassionate political position.
Okay.
I think
you're modifying a little bit now what you said before. You're opening it up.
Perhaps, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to be more accurate than what I said before.
Fair enough. Okay. In that case, it could be that you're completely wrong about your political position.
Yeah.
And that the most compassionate, enlightened view is maybe theocracy or benevolent dictatorship, or perhaps even, heaven forbid, in your case, a conservative from Mississippi. It could be that you're so wrong about your political. Yeah. Okay. So we've arrived. Okay, we've come to a different conclusion now. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, it could be, but I doubt it. Okay, at least for a U.S. political conservative position. A benevolent dictatorship, sure, that may be much better. It would have certainly more power to correct some of the faults that's going on, right? Rather than democracy, which is not working very well in the United States right now. So, yeah, there may be something that's better. The problem with dictatorships is what comes next, even if they are benevolent, right? So there's problems everywhere with all this stuff. It's just that I'm trying to operate from as compassionate as I can, and this is what I found. There may be a better way, and it may look quite different from where I've wound up. But I don't see a better way, or it would have wound up there.
Fair enough. Well, with all that said then, what advice would you give somebody who, having heard what you were saying about sharing some of your political view, you weren't comprehensive in it all, you were just sort of chatting really. And let's say they heard a few things there they disagree with. Or maybe they share your views actually. But all this talk of past Buddhist masters who had very different political views has made them maybe question a little bit whether their particular position is as enlightened as they thought it was, given that there were so many enlightened people in the past who had some very different view. In other words, the person is thinking they'd like to question their political view as a practitioner, whatever that view may be. What advice would you give in that regard? Is the advice to realize interdependence more deeply? Or is there advice beyond that?
Okay, I would say let's go back to the second step on the Eightfold Path. My advice would be to make your intentions for everything that you do letting go, love, and compassion. That's the advice I would give, right? Try acting in that way. And when you find it difficult to act in that way, find why it's difficult. Investigate that. In other words, it's a form of practice. And, take the Buddha's advice, His definitions of right view is hold all views lightly. In other places, it's the Four Noble Truths. And in other places, it's dependent origination. Okay, so that's first, right? Look at the world from that perspective. Now, act in a way that involves letting go, love, and compassion. If you can do that, it's going to be a lot easier to keep the precepts. That's right view, right action, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Doing that will set you up so that you can make right effort, not too much, not too little, banish the unpleasant, unwholesome states, encourage the wholesome states. Be mindful. Mindfulness shows up 900 suttas. It's an important part of the practice. It's the one thing that shows up more often as advice than anything else in the suttas. And then, learn to concentrate your mind. You'll see things more clearly with a concentrated mind. And I just laid out the Eightfold Path. This is what the Buddha is teaching. If you're serious about this path, then this is what you got to do. It seems to work. It seems to take people to a place where, not that their lives are easy, but where, at least for me, I don't make some of the stupid mistakes I used to make. And when things go wrong, I don't get as freaked out as I used to. That's the benefits of the path. So going back to where I said, can you allow me to share my screen?
Oh, yes, of course.
This list of topics, people, places. So here's the topics. All sorts of, here's the Brahma-viharas, here's Karuna. But don't forget Anukampa. These translations are Bhikkhu Sujato's translations. This is what I look for in the database I have of his suttas. I would translate Anukampa like Gilfranco's care. And actually, Karuna, compassion's not bad, but it's the opposite of cruelty. What's the opposite of cruelty? I would say kindness. Okay? Anyhow, mindfulness. And here we have the elements, a whole bunch of stuff about the elements. We look at mindfulness, 919 suttas. It's kind of important. And then here, mindfulness of the breathing is in 38, postures in 4, etc. But back at the top, I have references within the categories. The most common reference I found is vitakka, think or thought. And the second most common is mindfulness, wise or wisdom, concentration, wisdom, perception, not neither perception. That includes neither perception or non-perception, which is somewhat different than sanya. consciousness, asava. It gives you an idea what the Buddha was talking about in these categories. And if we go to total within the categories, Vitaka still for Savati, where the Buddha gave so many suttas, shows up. The rest of it's pretty similar. We go back to the references, go down to people, Anathapindika, because so much took place at Anathapindika's grove, right? Sariputta, Ananda, Kassapa, Mahamoggallana, Vajragota, etc. And then places, Savatthi, Anathapindika's monastery, Rajagaha, Kosambi, land of the Kurus. So that's when I say it occurs in so many suttas, this is where I'm getting this information. And I'll put the link to the where'd the chat go? Here we go, chat. There's the link to the page where I've done all this. So I have over 50 topics, people, places now that I've just, I built a database of Sujato suttas from the Sutta Central and run them through my program, which is a fairly smart database program. It's my program. I can tweak it as I wish and build these things.
Very cool. And you've also got a new book out. And I think, Leigh, we should meet again to talk about your book, because we've ended up talking about this instead. I think what you've done today in this conversation is very interesting indeed. You've gone into some very controversial waters. I think politics,
Yes.
it's like, politics, was it religion and politics is the thing you're never supposed to discuss at sea. When you're out, because if you do that, people fall out about those things. And when you're in a boat in the middle of the ocean, working for whoever it is, doesn't really matter anyway, best not to go there. And you've gone there. And, but I think what you've mostly done, and this, I'm reiterating this because it's the sort of thing that might get lost maybe when people have a different opinion to you particularly, is that, politically that is that you've really been trying to explain your relationship as a practitioner to politics per se, and then also to your specific political views. You've sort of done both of those things. And I think that's very interesting to hear you lay that out and explore that. And I myself have endeavored to remain very neutral, which I think is necessary foil for that kind of a thing, and to track the contours of your actual argument and to try to understand it better. So I think that's very interesting. I expect some people will be upset by their disagreement with either how you relate to politics per se as a practitioner. They'll think you're wrong about that, or they will disagree with your particular political views that you've arrived at. And certainly I think some people will be upset that you're implying that somehow your views are slightly more enlightened than maybe some others and so on. But, you've explained why you think that, and you've given reasons. And you've also given, I think, practice that those people can apply to interrogate their own views, to say, and who knows, maybe maybe their view will survive. I think it's my personal position, I think, is that it's possible to hold quite a number of different political views motivated by compassion. I'm not so convinced that one trends one way or the other on many issues. I mean, some issues, obviously, but on many issues, I think there's a good case to be made for both sides. It's perhaps part of the reason why there's so much disagreement. But anyway, that's besides the point. So I just want to say thank you for being willing to venture into that. You're very passionate about your political views, and I appreciate you answering and revealing, really, or exploring your relationship to all of that as an experienced practitioner of so many decades. So thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say at the end? Any kind of closing remarks or anything that you want to make sure is clear, or anything at all really that you'd like to remain to say?
Yeah. So number one, those are my views. All views should be held lightly. I'm attempting to hold them as lightly as I can. Two, this is my understanding of what is useful given my understanding of the interconnected nature of the universe and how to compassionately operate based on that. Number three, Ayakema said, don't try and make people happy. Tell them what you know from your own experience, which is what I've done today. And yeah, this is something you're not supposed to talk about. If this was a retreat center, I'm not supposed to talk about that because I would be introducing politics into something that's, 501(c) charity, and it's illegal to do that. Not that everybody behaves that way, but I think it's important, and I think it's important that people take the necessity of compassionate action into account when they're forming their political views, and beware of clinging to your own concepts, because that's how we get into trouble. And that's what all of the political arguing is about these days. These people don't deserve that. This is a human being. No, that's not a human being, etc., etc. This is dangerous. No, it's not dangerous. You misunderstand. No, you don't understand. And all of this is arguing over concepts. The world is not our concepts. Our concepts are our attempt to make sense of the world. And this includes even concepts like compassion. But from what I understand and have experienced for myself, operating in harmony with compassion works better than the other options.
Leigh Brasington, thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been very, very interesting and not at all what I expected.
Likewise. Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.